There is a quiet moment many people experience but rarely speak about. You say something in a room and no one responds. You share an idea and the conversation moves past it. You walk into a group and somehow become invisible. At first, it feels personal. You wonder if you spoke incorrectly, if you lack confidence, if something about you simply fails to command attention. But centuries ago, Niccolò Machiavelli observed something far less comforting in The Prince. People rarely ignore others because of kindness or cruelty. They ignore what appears weak. They ignore what carries no influence. They ignore what does not affect their interests. This is not a pleasant truth, but once understood, it explains why some voices are heard immediately, while others fade into silence. Almost everyone has felt this moment. You say something in a group and nobody reacts. Someone else speaks a few seconds later, says almost the same thing, and suddenly everyone listens. At first, it felt strange. You wonder if you spoke too quietly. Maybe your idea was not interesting enough. Maybe people were distracted. But when this happens again and again, the feeling becomes heavier. You start asking yourself a harder question. Why do people ignore me? Most people believe attention works like fairness. They think good ideas will always be heard, and honest effort will naturally earn respect. But human behavior rarely works that way. Centuries ago, Niccolò Machiavelli noticed something important about how people listen. In The Prince, he explained that people pay attention mainly to those they believe have power or influence, not always to those who are correct. When people enter a room, their minds quietly scan for signals. Who seems confident? Who already has respect? Who affects the situation? These signals decide who gets attention. Sometimes this happens before anyone even speaks. A person who looks uncertain, apologetic, or overly eager may be ignored without people realizing it. Not because others are cruel, but because the brain naturally follows what appears strong. This can feel unfair, but understanding this truth changes how you see the situation. Being ignored does not always mean your ideas are weak. Often it means your presence has not yet signaled influence. And once you see this clearly, something important happens. The problem stops feeling mysterious. It becomes something you can observe. Because attention is not random. It follows perception. Many people believe attention comes from talking more. They think if they explain their ideas better, speak louder, or try harder to prove themselves, people will finally start listening. But attention rarely works this way. In most social situations, people decide who matters before the conversation even begins. They look at small signals: how someone walks into a room, how calmly they sit, how they react when others speak. These details send quiet messages. Centuries ago, Niccolò Machiavelli wrote about this in The Prince. He explained that people respond strongly to the appearance of power, not just real power, but what looks powerful. If someone appears calm, steady, and sure of themselves, others naturally pay attention. If someone appears nervous, overly eager, or desperate to be heard, the opposite often happens. This is not because people are cruel. It is because the human mind follows signals of influence. Psychologists call this status perception. The brain constantly asks a quiet question: who here matters the most? Once the mind decides the answer, attention follows that person. This is why some people speak only a few words and everyone listens. It is not always about intelligence. It is about presence. And many people make a common mistake. When they feel ignored, they try to talk more. They explain longer. They push harder. They try to prove their point again and again. But this often makes the problem worse, because trying too hard to gain attention can make someone look less confident. And confidence, more than words, is what people actually notice. Once you understand this, the situation becomes clearer. Attention is not given to the loudest voice. It usually follows the person who appears the most certain. When someone feels ignored, the first reaction is usually emotional. They feel frustrated, embarrassed, sometimes even angry. It can feel personal, as if others are deliberately refusing to listen. But in many cases, something else is happening. The human mind works quickly when judging people. Within seconds, it forms an impression of who seems important and who does not. This process is almost automatic. Psychologists call it social ranking. In every group, people quietly organize others into invisible levels of influence. Who leads? Who follows? Who speaks with weight? Centuries ago, Niccolò Machiavelli described something very similar in The Prince. He observed that people rarely respect someone simply because they deserve it. Respect often follows the perception of authority. If a person appears uncertain, people may unconsciously place them lower in this invisible social structure. Once that position is formed, something subtle happens. The group starts responding differently. Ideas from that person may receive less attention. Interruptions happen more easily. Their voice becomes easier to overlook. Again, this is rarely intentional. Most people do not realize they are doing it. They are simply following social signals their minds believe. This explains why some individuals walk into a room and immediately command attention. Not because they talk the most, but because their presence signals certainty. Their movements are slower. Their reactions are calmer. They do not rush to prove themselves. These signals quietly tell others something important. This person does not need approval. And strangely, when someone stops seeking approval, people often begin giving attention naturally. Because the psychology of attention is not only about words, it is about perceived status. And perceived status often decides who is heard and who is ignored. ... And who is ignored. ... When someone feels ignored for a long time, the real battle begins inside the mind. At first, the reaction was simple confusion. Why didn't they listen? Did I say something wrong? But when the same situation happens again and again, something deeper starts to form. Self-doubt. A person may begin questioning their ideas, their confidence, even their value in the group. They start speaking less, or sometimes the opposite happens. They begin trying harder than ever to be heard. They explain more. They defend their opinions. They interrupt conversations to add their thoughts. But strangely, this effort often makes the problem worse. Because when someone tries too hard to be accepted, people can sense it. And the moment others sense desperation for attention, respect quietly decreases. This is one of the uncomfortable truths about human behavior. Centuries ago, Niccolò Machiavelli noticed something similar while observing political leaders. In The Prince, he explained that power weakens when someone constantly seeks approval from others. Leaders who begged for loyalty often lost it. Those who appeared calm and self-reliant kept it. This same pattern appears in everyday life. When a person constantly pushes for recognition, people begin seeing them as less influential. Not because they lack ability, but because their behavior signals dependence. And dependence quietly shifts the balance of power. This is why being ignored can create a painful cycle. The more someone feels invisible, the more they try to prove themselves. And the more they try to prove themselves, the less attention they receive. Breaking this cycle does not begin by speaking louder. It begins by seeing the pattern clearly. Because once someone understands that attention follows perception, they can start changing the signals they send. There is usually a quiet moment when something becomes clear. A person suddenly realizes that being ignored is not always about intelligence, ideas, or effort. It is about perception. Once this realization appears, the situation begins to look different. Instead of asking, "Why don't they listen to me?" the mind starts asking a different question. What signals am I sending without noticing? This moment of awareness is powerful. Because attention often depends on subtle behaviors, people rarely examine how quickly someone speaks, how eagerly they respond to others, how often they try to explain themselves. These small habits can quietly shape how others see them. Centuries ago, Niccolò Machiavelli described a similar truth in The Prince. He explained that influence is rarely built by constantly proving oneself. Instead, influence grows when a person controls how they appear. Leaders who spoke less but with certainty were often taken more seriously. Those who reacted slowly were seen as stronger. Those who did not rush to defend themselves seemed more confident. These behaviors created a quiet shift. People started paying attention, not because they were forced to, but because the signals had changed. In everyday life, this change often begins with small adjustments, speaking calmly instead of quickly, allowing silence after making a point, not reacting immediately to every comment. At first, these changes feel unusual, but something interesting happens. When a person stops chasing attention, people often become curious, and curiosity brings focus, because attention, strangely enough, often moves toward the person who seems least desperate to receive it. This is the moment where the dynamic starts to shift, not loudly, but quietly. Once someone understands how attention works, the next change begins slowly. It is not about becoming louder or more aggressive. It is about becoming steadier. This is where quiet authority begins to form. Instead of reacting quickly, a person begins to pause before speaking. Instead of explaining every thought, they choose their words carefully. Instead of chasing attention, they allow silence to exist. At first, these changes may seem small, but they send a powerful signal. People start noticing the difference. A person who remains calm during disagreement appears stronger. A person who does not rush to prove themselves appears more confident. These behaviors quietly change how others respond. Centuries ago, Niccolò Machiavelli described this kind of influence while observing rulers in The Prince. He noticed that leaders who controlled themselves often controlled situations more easily. Those who reacted emotionally could be predicted. Those who stayed disciplined were harder to manipulate. This is an important principle. The person who governs their reactions becomes difficult to control. And when someone becomes difficult to control, people begin treating them differently. Conversations shift. Interruptions become less common. Ideas start receiving more attention. Not because the person demanded respect, but because their presence now signals stability. And stability is something people instinctively follow. This stage is not about pretending to be powerful. It is about becoming internally steady. When someone stops reacting to every opinion, criticism, or challenge, they create space around their words. That space makes those words carry more weight. Over time, this quiet discipline builds something important: influence. Not the loud kind that demands attention, but the calm kind that naturally receives it. Over time, something interesting begins to happen. The person who once felt ignored starts noticing a change. Conversations feel different. People pause longer after they speak. Interruptions happen less often. Ideas receive more attention. But the biggest change is not outside. It is inside. The need to be noticed slowly disappears. This is the final shift. When someone no longer depends on attention to feel confident, their behavior naturally becomes calmer and more controlled. And strangely, this is often the moment when attention finally arrives. Centuries ago, Niccolò Machiavelli described something similar in The Prince. He observed that those who appear self-sufficient command greater respect, not because they demand it, but because people instinctively follow individuals who seem comfortable without approval. This is one of the quiet truths about human nature. Attention rarely follows the person who asks for it. It often follows the person who does not need it. When someone becomes calm in silence, careful in speech, and disciplined in reaction, their presence begins to change. Others start paying closer attention, not because the person forced them to, but because confidence and stability naturally attract focus. At this stage, being ignored no longer feels like a problem. It becomes information. If a room does not listen, the person simply speaks less. If a group does not value ideas, the person saves their energy. This is not arrogance, it is clarity. Because once someone understands how attention truly works, they stop chasing it. And when attention is no longer chased, it often begins to appear on its own, quietly, naturally, almost without effort. If you prefer the uncomfortable truth over comforting lies, subscribe to join a community of observers.